Brand loyalty can, at times, be a weird thing. Even when you don't actively support a company by buying its products as soon as they get released, you probably have strong opinions on some of the world's most popular brands and their biggest competitors. You're either a Coca-Cola person or a Pepsi person, an iPhone loyalist or a Samsung enthusiast. And whether you're a hardcore gamer or not, you're surely either an Xbox fan or a PlayStation fiend. You can't help but choose a side in the console wars. However, while the biggest players in the console wars of today are, of course, Microsoft and Sony, with their aforementioned Xbox and PlayStation, they aren't the companies that started it all. The first war was fought by the still-beloved Nintendo and the all-but-forgotten SEGA. At its height, controlling over 60% of the North American market, SEGA was perhaps the biggest gaming brand of its time. Its reign didn't last long, though. By the late 90s/early 2000s, its reputation crumbled, and gamers started turning their attention to better and more affordable consoles. If you want to understand how this brand rose to fame and ultimately met its doom, we need to start the story from the beginning. Not many brands have an interesting backstory, but this one certainly does. SEGA was founded in 1940 by Irving Bromberg, a coin-op distributor, his son Bromley, and his friend James Humpert. At the start of World War II, there was expectedly an increased influx of military personnel in the US. Though there's no denying that they were busy fighting the war, they needed something to do to take their minds off it during their leisure time. Enter the Brombergs. Under the name Standard Games, the Brombergs and Humpert started developing coin-operated machines, not unlike slots, and selling them to military bases across Hawaii. This continued throughout the war, and by 1945, they established a second company going under the name California Games. Within a year, Standard Games and California Games dissolved, and Irving, Bromley, and James established a new brand that came to be known as Service Games. Though things were going well, by the early 1950s, slot machines had become outlawed in the US, so the trio had to find a way to stay in business. Identifying Japan as the best location for their new headquarters, Service Games of Japan started supplying US military bases in the country with something to do during their time off. Over the coming years, the company kept growing, and ultimately merged with Rosen Enterprises, an importer of coin-operated games in Japan. Though depending on who you ask, the deal was more of an acquisition rather than a merger. Together, the two companies became known as SEGA Enterprises. SEGA coming from the first two letters in the words Service and Games, and Enterprises coming from Rosen Enterprises. With this merger/acquisition, SEGA stepped away from supplying military bases with some amusement and focused on expanding its audiences, first importing machines such as jukeboxes and pinballs, and then transitioning to manufacturing them. By 1965, SEGA released its very first arcade game, Periscope, to resounding success. Through the 70s and 80s, SEGA became one of the most renowned arcade game developers, reaching a revenue of over $200 million. It was the first brand to release a racing game with a third-person point of view, Turbo. It featured full-color graphics and changing scenery, becoming a global hit. By 1981, SEGA released its most famous arcade to date, Frogger, a whimsical game where your task is to guide frogs home through busy roads and dangerous rivers. However, as the arcade boom was coming to a close, SEGA needed to find another way to connect with its audiences. So it turned its sights on the home console industry. Even though the console market was only starting to take off, SEGA had the hardware and software expertise in-house to make for a seamless transition. So, in July 1983, SEGA released its first ever home console, the SG-1000. The timing could have been better if we're being honest, as Nintendo's family computer Famicom, known as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES for short. Still, things ultimately turned in SEGA's favor. SEGA didn't expect much of its SG-1000, setting projections to sell no more than 50,000 units, give or take. But as fate would have it, over 160,000 units were sold in 1983 alone. While it would be nice to say that such unexpected sales were the result of SEGA's ingenuity, its focus on innovation, or its well-thought-out marketing campaigns, that's not how the story unfolded. Nintendo had to recall thousands of its Famicom units due to technical issues and faulty circuits. As consumers didn't have many other options, they turned to SEGA. Though the brand's fortune didn't last long. With Famicom units fixed, Nintendo came back with a vengeance the following year. It was generally seen as the better console as it had a much greater library of games. You see, unlike Sega, which didn't want to collaborate with its previous arcade competitors, Nintendo didn't shy away from partnering with third-party game developers. And that's how the first console wars began. To outperform Nintendo, Sega started heavily investing in its hardware and game development. In 1984, it released its SG-1002, which came with 2 joypads. In 1985, it redesigned its Mark III console, rebranding it the Master System. It started porting games from third-party developers. Still, none of it proved fruitful. Nintendo kept reigning supreme, especially in North America, due to its vast game library and family-friendly marketing. So, Sega started upping the ante on its marketing. In 1988, Sega released its SEGA Genesis console, also known as the Mega Drive, outside the US. The console was amazing. It was the first 16-bit console, it had a futuristic design, it was responsive, fast, and it featured an array of games. Still, the Super Nintendo was more successful, at least until Sega boosted its marketing campaign. Instead of presenting itself as a family-friendly option, it started highlighting the differences between the Super Nintendo and SEGA Genesis. Genesis was edgy, fast, and light, whereas SNES was slow and cumbersome. SNES was afraid to make its games graphic, whereas Genesis didn't shy away from showing blood in its games. According to Sega's campaign at the time, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. To add insult to injury, Sega also reduced the price of its consoles, making them significantly more affordable for all gamers. Finally, Sega became the home gaming console to have. The aggressive marketing worked so well that Sega sold over 30.75 million units. As a console designed for hardcore gamers, Sega Genesis released dozens of awesome games that many players still love to come back to. Without a doubt, its biggest game was Sonic the Hedgehog. Nintendo had its mascot of sorts, the best Italian plumber there ever was, Mario, so Sega had to create its own mascot to rival him. Thus, Sonic was born. Designed by Naoto Oshima, Sonic the Hedgehog took the world by storm, becoming one of the biggest game franchises. In all likelihood, you grew up addicted to the game, or at the very least envious of those who had the chance to. Sonic was everything that Mario wasn't: edgy, confident, and above all, fast, which proved to be its key to success. If you remember, we didn't really get many games with the save functionality in the early 90s. We needed to spring through the games to complete the levels. With Mario, this was a slow, lengthy process. With Sonic, it was all about speed. You could zoom through the levels, collect your rewards, and keep exploring the game as fast as you wanted. Of course, for those gamers who weren't as into Sonic, there were other games in the repertoire. Disney's Aladdin was a massive success, selling over 4 million copies worldwide. Mortal Kombat was gory, bloody, and breathtaking on Sega Genesis, becoming one of the most recognizable games on the console. NBA Jam stole the hearts of over 3.2 million gamers, while Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition could only be properly enjoyed on the Genesis despite being available on other consoles. Other reputable titles include Mrs. Pac-Man, X-Men, Altered Beast, and Jurassic Park, to name but a few. All saw resounding success, cementing Sega Genesis as the most beloved console of the 90s. Of course, one of the main reasons for Sega's rising popularity was its games were action-packed and brutal. Mortal Kombat on Nintendo, for instance, was pretty family-friendly. It didn't seem all that violent, and you couldn't see a single drop of blood during the gameplay. Sega, on the other hand, left the game as savage as it was initially intended. There are plenty of other fun facts about Sega and its games. Did you know that Sega Genesis came with online features? Through the Sega Channel service, players could connect to the internet through their cable TV providers and access games such as Mega Man: The Wily Wars. Sega also had a mascot of sorts before Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic was only created as a marketing tactic against Nintendo. Before him, however, Sega's mascot was a half-monkey, half-human character named Alex Kidd. Of course, Alex Kidd could never take on Nintendo's Mario quite as well as Sonic did. Another interesting tidbit about the Sega and Nintendo's rivalry is that it's not only Sega that was aggressively trying to take over the home gaming console market. Nintendo was never known to pull punches, and the company even went so far as to convince retailers not to stock Genesis. Sega had to invest in heavy marketing campaigns to convince Walmart, for instance, to start stocking its console. Despite the success of the Sega Genesis console, the company's luck started running out. Sega released its Sega CD peripheral, limiting access only to those who already had Genesis. Sales were nothing to write home about, and the peripheral even brought on legal issues for the company, starting the whole "video games are violent" argument. In an attempt to get back on track, Sega released the successor to Genesis in 1995, the long-awaited Sega Saturn. Though a fine console, it was more expensive than the newly released PlayStation. It didn't have as many games as Nintendo 64, and it was still focusing on 2D games instead of entering the realm of 3D. Unsurprisingly, sales flopped. Finally, Sega tried to recuperate with the release of the Sega Dreamcast in 1998. Though promising at first, the Sega Dreamcast ultimately failed miserably. It boasted VMU attachments that had a memory card and acted as an additional screen. It came with improved power, internet connectivity, and a 120-bit gaming system. Though initial sales were promising, Sega just couldn't compete with Nintendo, PlayStation, and a newcomer to the market, Xbox. Ultimately, only around 9 million Dreamcast units were sold, and Sega discontinued it by 2001. Several parts were at play that led to Sega's downfall. Primarily, Electronic Arts, better known as EA, pulled out of its contract with Sega after the launch of Dreamcast. The two companies couldn't settle on terms, so EA, one of the biggest game developers at the time, decided to step back. Another issue was the resounding success of the PlayStation, a significantly more powerful console with unique features, such as the DVD drive, that allowed players to enjoy their favorite games and favorite movies, blew Sega out of the water. Nintendo also enjoyed massive success with its own games and consoles, and Sega was left to eat dust. It seems that Mario proved to be a better racer than Sonic. Sega could have handled these challenges had the leadership been consistent and had the developers focus on pleasing the customers rather than overtaking the competitors. After Dreamcast's failure, Sega pulled out of the gaming console market in 2001 and was acquired by the Sammy Corporation in 2003. It's now a third-party software developer and publisher operating under the name of Sega Group. There are rumors circulating that Sega is looking for another shot in the home game console market, though we have nothing conclusive as of yet. Would you like to see Sega return? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.